Okay, everybody, let's get started. Thank you for waiting for a few minutes in the waiting room. I hope it's a comfortable waiting room. So I want to introduce Dr. Christie Byun, and Christie has been at Wabash for 15 years to cover this session. This is the first time she's done this. I know many of you have been on sessions before. Some of you, this is your first after the bell session. So this is going to be a lot of fun. We'll go from 7:30 until 8:30. At 8:30, then I'll jump in and we'll close it up. But really appreciate Dr. Byun's time. So let's just not waste any time. Let's get to her. You don't want to hear me talk. So Christie Byun.
Hi, everybody. Nice to kind of see you all tonight and welcome. I'm so glad to see you all here for this topic, fashion, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So as Steve mentioned, I'm Christie Byun here at Wabash College in the economics department. So I teach a variety of classes: statistics, econometrics, environmental econ, and a class on fashion, a freshman tutorial on fashion. And it's been a really fun course to teach. I absolutely love it. And so the title of this talk came from the title of that course, Fashion, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship, or How to Dress Like a Gentleman in the 21st Century. So let's see here. How did all this get started? Some of you may be familiar with a TV show called What Not to Wear. So this is a show on TLC. It's no longer, they don't have it anymore, but basically this was a program, a reality show on called What Not to Wear on TLC. And the premise of the show was, okay, so here's an image that shows its two hosts, Stacey London and Clinton Kelly. And basically the premise of the show was that friends and family would nominate somebody that they knew that they thought was in need of a makeover. And so Stacey and Clinton would basically find this person in their home city or wherever they lived and ambush them by surprise and give them the news that they'd been nominated to be a contestant on What Not to Wear. And what that involved was a free trip to New York City where they'd get a full makeover, hair, makeup, and they'd get to shop for a week using the rules that Stacey and Clinton specified for them for their fashion makeover. And they would get $5,000 of money to shop for a whole new wardrobe. Okay. So this is kind of mind-boggling to me, like, wow, $5,000 to spend on a whole new wardrobe, a free trip to New York. This is incredible. What a great opportunity, right? But I found myself fascinated because of the fact that so many contestants were kind of initially very resistant to this idea. Because here's the catch. Here's the catch of the show, right? So they get this free trip, they get the $5,000, but what they had to do was bring their entire wardrobe to New York City, and Stacey and Clinton would go through all their wardrobe, and whatever they would say has to go would get thrown in the trash. Absolutely no question about it, right? And so what was so fascinating was that so many people were very, very resistant to giving up their whole old wardrobe. So their old wardrobes might be out of style, worn out, full of holes, not fit anymore, all kinds of stuff. But a lot of contestants I saw were very, very resistant to getting rid of their old wardrobe. And I started to realize, wow, there's so much psychology associated with their wardrobe, with their fashion, with basically their outward appearance, that it made me realize, wow, fashion is something in which we are, what are we doing? We are conveying information to the outside world about who we are as a person, what choices we've made, what station in life we're at, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these contestants, for example, might have had some kind of like psychological stuff that they've gone through in the past that was maybe associated with their old wardrobes. And it was hard for them to move forward in their life. And that wardrobe, that old wardrobe, was kind of like baggage holding them back. And so it's fascinating to see how important fashion and psychology were, how intricately related they were with one another, and somebody's identity as a person, right? Because basically how we present ourselves to the world essentially tells the world kind of who we are as a person in many ways. So whether this is a superficial thing or not a superficial thing, whatever your consideration may be about that, basically fashion is giving the world information about who we are as a person. It's really, really tied up with our identity in so many ways. And so this inspired me to come up with a class on fashion at Wabash College. And I got to tell you, when I first mentioned this idea to some of my more seasoned colleagues, some of them looked at me like I was a little bit crazy, like, what are you talking about? You want to teach a fashion class at an all-male college? Are you nuts or something? So that was kind of funny, right? But I think the thing is that who is more interested in who they are and what their identity is than somebody who's entering college, right? They're figuring out their place in life. They're figuring out what they're interested in, what they want to study, what extracurriculars they have. So their identity is deeply, deeply tied up, I think, in the way they present themselves. So even though it may not to the casual eye seem like there's not much fashion going on here at Wabash College, I would totally disagree. We just have to read the cues and understand the language of fashion, no matter where we are, to be able to get a better sense of who people are and what they're trying to say to us. So this is how all this got started. So I started thinking a lot about fashion and identity, and we see that there are images like all around us where we can get a sense of who people are just by kind of getting a sense of what they're wearing. So here's a couple of examples. So here are some three world leaders, so Nelson Mandela, Angela Merkel, and Emmanuel Macron. So each of them world leaders, world famous, representative of their countries, and basically giving us some information based upon the clothing that they're wearing. So Nelson Mandela on the left there, he's wearing a shirt that's a traditional African print. And that's a whole other story in and of itself. That style of print is bound up and wrapped up with ideas of globalization and trade routes and all this kind of stuff. But that's another story that we'll have to tell another day. Angela Merkel wearing a very, very clean cut red, kind of almost a minimalist suit. And then Emmanuel Macron on the far right there, again, wearing a very, very slim cut, kind of a men's business kind of a suit. So each of these world leaders in their own way are basically sending a message to the world based upon the manner of clothing that they've chosen, their manner of dress, essentially, right? So it ranges from the business to other types of items that have a little bit more symbolic meaning behind them. Here's some more examples from the business world. So this is a picture of Jack Ma, who's the head of Alibaba, which is essentially the equivalent of Amazon for China. So again, a very clean cut, business suit with a tie, kind of a look, very, very crisp looking appearance there. Here's another example of a business leader, Sheryl Sandberg, who's a COO of Meta. So again, a very kind of a clean cut minimalist, a little bit more feminine style because, she's wearing a more feminized version of the suit essentially, right? But again, a very clean cut minimalist look. Here's a slightly different sort of a business look. This woman on the bottom left is Lindsay Snyder, who's the owner and head of In-N-Out Burger, the In-N-Out Burger chain that you may have heard of. So again, it's a business look, but a very different kind of a business look. And then finally, of course, in the tech world, Steve Jobs, this kind of very, very iconic image we have of him when he's giving his talks, the Apple Talks. He's wearing the black mock turtleneck, the jeans, the sneakers, very casual kind of look. So Silicon Valley imagery, Silicon Valley fashion in terms of Silicon Valley business is also quite interesting in and of itself because of the fact that you don't often see the suits. You don't see the suit and tie combination. You'll often see a more casual type of look like Steve Jobs is wearing and popularized in his day. So that's conveying messaging in and of itself in a particular way. It's a different kind of a signal. So again, we have another image of Mark Zuckerberg. So he wore and popularized, of course, he became very famous for this type of a look, the gray t-shirt, the hoodie. Apparently at one point in his life, his entire wardrobe, all it was gray t-shirts and hoodies and jeans. This is pretty much all he wore. This is an image of him in around 2012, 2013. But I couldn't help noticing that this fashion look of a Silicon Valley kind of a guy, this kind of hacker guy who's going to kind of upend the world, right, was actually, it had its precedent back in 1984. So I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with this movie. It's a movie called War Games from 1984. And this is an image of the starring actor, Matthew Broderick, back in his day when he was basically like a teenager in his early 20s. And he's a computer geek in Seattle. He accidentally breaks into the US Department of Defense's, computer system and almost sets off World War III, essentially, right? But you'll notice his outfit is exactly the same as Mark Zuckerberg's, only 30 years earlier. So he's basically the one who did it first. Other examples, the military. The military is such an inspiration for fashion, this kind of clean-cut militaristic styling, this beautiful tailoring and whatnot. This is an image of General Dwight Eisenhower during World War II, and his jacket became known as the Eisenhower jacket, and it became very, very popular. Well, okay, let me tell you the origin story first of all. So essentially, he wanted a military jacket for the US Army that was more functional. He wanted it a little bit more clean cut, a little bit shorter, a little bit more functional based upon the work that service members had to do in the field. So he asked for the military jacket to be modified in these particular ways, and he came up with this so-called Eisenhower jacket. And this Eisenhower jacket really kind of took off, not only in the military, it got adopted, I believe, by the US Air Force. And then later on, when Eisenhower became president, I think the US Postal Service also adopted it as part of their uniform. But the Eisenhower jacket and the variations of it have survived in fashion today in the following form, in the form of a workwear jacket. So the brand Dickies, for example, has a jacket that they call the Eisenhower jacket. It's a variant of the one that Eisenhower wore in the military, right? So a form of the original Eisenhower jacket still exists today as a very popular workwear jacket that's quite functional, that's been adopted a lot by people in a variety of different fields and environments, and including in the fashion industry, right? In the fashion field. So this is an image from a fashion blogger showing how he styled his own Eisenhower jacket in a particular way with a baseball cap and the sneakers and whatnot. So it's taken off really in terms of both a workwear item, but also a popular culture item in terms of fashion styling and so on and so forth. So the military is a great inspiration for different types of fashion items that have kind of filtered down into the popular consciousness as well. Oh, the music industry. The music industry is another field in which fashion, of course, is absolutely key. This is an image from a hip hop group, Run DMC, back in, I believe, 1984. Okay, so this was a seminal hip hop group in the 80s. And so they have this very signature look of the black sweatshirts, the gold chains, black hats, the jeans, the pants. And the key item in their look was their Adidas sneakers. And if you look a little bit closely, you'll notice that they're not wearing any shoelaces with their sneakers. That became kind of like their fashion key point, essentially, right? So basically the Adidas sneakers without the laces became like the thing that kind of defined Run DMC. Here's another really fascinating image. This is the singer Bjork at the Academy Awards in 2001. So you may be familiar with this image. She's wearing this this infamous swan dress. So when she showed up on the red carpet wearing this thing, I mean, the reaction was quite strong. It was quite intense. It was like, what is this? This is a crazy dress. Why is she wearing something so insane? This is the weirdest outfit, you know? And it's kind of fascinating to me because though it was 20 years ago, people are still talking about it. It still makes the top list of memorable historical moments on the red carpet at the Academy Awards. I mean, love it or hate it, this swan dress has become a cultural icon, essentially, that really instantly, when we see it, we know exactly who it is, where she wore it, and our reaction to her, our visceral, strong sense of what this means. Another example, Lady Gaga. This, I believe, was, let's see here, I think this was 2010, 2012, now I can't remember, but this is a singer, Lady Gaga. She's wearing a dress that is literally made out of meat, literally made out of beef. It's this fascinating thing, right? And she chose this fashion item to basically convey a message, to send a message, to say to the world, you may treat me as a piece of meat, you may look at me as a piece of meat, but I am not that. And if you want to believe that I'm a piece of meat, then fine, I'll wear the dress that makes you, that confirms what you might think of me, but I'm here to tell you that I am not a piece of meat. This dress, this so-called meat dress, is been preserved. It's on display at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. You could see it there. It's been preserved, like I mentioned, and it kind of looks like beef jerky now. It's all dried up and kind of funky looking, whatnot, but it's fascinating to look at if you ever get a chance to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Okay, so what next? I want to talk briefly about a book called The Travels of a T-Shirt in a Global Economy. We talked about this book in my class and also listened to a series of podcasts that a program called Planet Money on NPR. What they did was they followed a T-shirt around the world from its very beginning to its very end. And when I say its very beginning, I mean from the cotton grown in the fields and harvested and spun into thread and woven into cloth and cut into a T-shirt and screen printed and shipped all around the world until it finally ended up like in their hands. And so here's an image of those T-shirts. So they designed a men's T-shirt and a women's T-shirt. So the gray one on the left is the men's, and the lilac one on the right is the women's. And the design on it was real simple, just a squirrel holding a martini glass. And these journalists wanted to follow essentially the footsteps of this T-shirt as described in this book. So this book was written by a professor. She's a business professor at Georgetown University. But they wanted to see where a T-shirt would go from beginning to end, from basically birth to death, and then its afterlife. And they traced this T-shirt. So again, from its very origins, for looking at cotton in the field all the way to the end product, to see the entire steps of the process of how our clothing is made, where it's made, what it's made out of, and what do we do with it? What happens to it after we dispose of it? So it's this fascinating series of reports that we listened to as part of the class. And we studied as a part of kind of like getting an understanding of how important, say, globalization and international trade is to the clothing industry. So what are our clothes made of? We looked at that as well. Here is a close-up of various fibers. So if you've ever looked at fibers underneath the microscope, they're very interesting to look at. So from left to right, you see wool, coarse wool, fine wool, alpaca, cashmere, silk, linen, cotton, and polyester. So if you look at any of these fibers under a microscope, you can get a sense of like, oh, no wonder wool feels so itchy. It's got all those little overlapping scales. It behaves in a particular way. Cashmere's got fewer scales, so it's a little bit softer than coarse wool would be. Silk looks a particular way because it's extruded from an animal. Cotton's got that twist to it. Linen's a little bit rough, tiny bit rough. And polyester looks like a smooth tube. So polyester is an extruded kind of a fiber, meaning that, okay, so it's made out of petroleum products. And think about like a tube of toothpaste. If you squeeze that tube of toothpaste, the toothpaste will come out in like kind of a long, kind of a tubular strip kind of a thing. That's essentially how polyester is created out of petroleum products. Here's an image of cotton grown in the fields. So the t-shirt that they followed around the world, they looked at the cotton that was grown in the fields of South Texas. And here's a close-up of what the cotton balls look like. So all this cotton that's produced in this particular region of the United States, harvested, processed, and then sent across the world to be spun into yarn and so on and so forth. So that's what our clothes are made of. So in this particular case, we're looking at a cotton t-shirt, although increasingly we find that a lot of our clothes are made more from basically man-made fibers, essentially from petroleum, essentially polyester. Okay, where are our clothes made? So here's an image of two young women who are garment factory workers in Chittagong, Bangladesh. So a lot of the times, a majority of the time, in fact, most of our clothing is made abroad by garment workers in different parts of the world. So here are two young women who started in the garment factory. They left their home village at a relatively early age when they were teenagers to go work in the city in a garment factory. So these are two sisters. And here's an image that shows what their home village looks like. Okay, so they live in their home village is a little bit outside of Chittagong, Bangladesh. And Chittagong, Bangladesh is a coastal town. But this is an image of one of the girls. She's gone home to visit her parents. And then that little girl in the yellow dress is her daughter. She only sees her every once in a while because she works all the time. And so her young daughter lives with her parents, essentially the grandparents. And the grandparents take care of her daughter while mom's working essentially in the garment factories. This is a graphic that shows where our clothes are made. So if you look at the horizontal axis has got time. It starts from the year 1800 all the way to beyond the year 2000. And the lightest line shows the United Kingdom. And this graph shows textiles and clothing as a share of a country's total manufacturing exports. So if you think about all the stuff that's manufactured in a country and what percentage of it is made up of textiles or clothing, this is what this graph is telling you. So for example, if we're looking at the United Kingdom, at its peak, 70% of the stuff that it manufactured and exported was textiles and clothing. And it's dropped down now. If you look at the year 2000, it's probably less than 5%. But at its peak, at its heyday, it was 70% of its manufactured exports. And now it's down to less than 5%, I'd say. The next darkest line right here, I'll move my mouse to it. That's Japan right there. So again, Japan had this plateau here in the early 1900s, dropped off a little bit after during the war, kind of reached, it's not a peak. I wouldn't say it's a peak, but basically in the year 1950 is where you start seeing that drop off. After the year 1950 is where its share of manufacturing exports that are consisting of textiles and clothing dropped off pretty dramatically. Then you see China. China is this line right here. This line right here. So China had this sharp spike in the late 1980s and 1990s, and its share of manufacturing exports in terms of clothing and apparel and textiles has dropped since then. And then you look at Bangladesh, and it's been, with an exception right here, it's been on a steady upward climb. So Bangladesh, it looks like about 90% of its manufacturing exports are comprised of clothing and textiles. So a pretty significant chunk of the stuff that they manufacture and export is made up of clothing, essentially, and textiles and fabrics and materials. Next is a graph that shows minimum wage by country. So this is for countries that are in the garment industry. So these are the top apparel exporting countries in US dollars. And you can see these are monthly minimum wages by country. So for instance, Hong Kong, $800 a month is their monthly minimum wage. And at the very bottom of the list is Bangladesh at about $68 a month, which is a tremendously, relatively trivial amount of money for garment workers to be making, essentially, right? So you can kind of see where this is heading, right? Companies would like to produce their items in the countries in which the costs are minimized. This is what they do as companies. They try to find where they can minimize their cost of production, and labor is a big chunk of that cost of production. They're going to go wherever those costs of production are the cheapest. Bangladesh is one of those countries, India, Vietnam, increasingly Southeast Asia, not so much East Asia anymore. Some parts of South and Central America and the Middle East also are increasingly becoming more prominent in terms of textile and clothing manufacturing, you'll see, because of the fact that the wages there are relatively low. So where are our clothes made? To continue with this. Now, this is an image of a garment worker. This is a photo of a garment worker sewing clothing. This is an image from 1905. Now, the thing about the garment industry, the clothing industry, is that you cannot fully mechanize clothing production. It's incredibly difficult to do so, if not impossible, because of the intricacies involved with making clothing. All the seams to be sewn, buttons to be put on, decorations, and all that kind of stuff. It's impossible for it to be fully mechanized. You need somebody with hands on the sewing machine actually making those pieces of clothing. So this is an image of a garment worker in 1905. Things haven't changed much. This is an image of a garment worker in 2013. So the work is exactly the same. It's just the location has changed. So instead of being manufactured in the United States, we've shipped that manufacturing abroad to Bangladesh. Here's another couple of images. This is an image of a child worker in a factory that's spinning yarn. So when we think of yarn, we tend to think of yarn like knitting and sweaters and stuff like that. But in the industry, yarn actually means thread. So this image here, you can see the spools of thread, what we'd call thread, but basically they call it yarn in the industry, being spun on these giant spools. And the child worker there to make sure that things are like going okay and the threads aren't snapping and all kinds of stuff. Okay, this is 1905. And this is an image of the same kind of a process, a spinning factory in the year 2013. So again, the process hasn't changed that much. I mean, there's been some improvements in mechanization and stuff like that, but the process is almost identical. The workers are almost all the same. It's just that this work is being done in a different place now. This is an image of a headline from a very tragic fire that broke out in a garment factory in 1911. So this is an image from a headline from that indicates the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So in the upper floors of this building, the building that you see in the picture on the left, there was a garment factory on those upper floors, and a fire broke out there, spread very quickly, and many workers died. About 150 workers died, and they're mostly very young women, teenagers, young women, a lot of immigrant women who didn't speak a lot of English. And tragically, about 150 died. Many of them either burned to death or inhaled smoke and died, or jumped to their death from those upper floors to escape the flames. And the worker protections in that day and age were quite minimal. There were almost none. And there were only like 2 stairwells that the girls could escape to, and one of them was locked to prevent girls from taking unauthorized breaks. It was kind of a terrible condition for workers to be working. They worked 12-hour days every single day, all this kind of really, really bad working conditions. And so this fire that broke out and killed so many people, it sparked quite a bit of outrage and brought quite a bit of attention to the poor working conditions for people in this type of industry. So the only silver lining associated with this tragic fire is that it led to some improvements in working conditions for people who are working in quite difficult circumstances, some improvements. So what's changed in the contemporary era? Well, if your clothing is made in Bangladesh or Nepal or India or any other place outside of the United States, mostly, it's probably manufactured in a building like this. So the upper floors of this building contain several garment factories with a lot of heavy machinery equipment, sewing machines, processing machines, all this kind of stuff. And most of our clothing, a lot of our clothing is made in factories like this. So all brands do this. Nike, The Gap, H&M, Zara, Target, J.Crew, Banana Republic, basically all companies are going to source their clothing from garment factories around the world. Okay, this is just the reality of the world we live in right now, due to a variety of reasons: globalization, free trade, technology, improvements in supply chains, all this kind of stuff, all have led to the fact that we are having our clothes are being manufactured in factories similar to this one in Bangladesh. This building in particular is called Rana Plaza, which you may be familiar with. So Rana Plaza is infamous because it was the site of a very tragic building collapse, where essentially what happened is that the upper floors of that building collapsed and pancaked down, okay, and it ended up killing upward of 1,000 people and injuring probably another 2,500. And so this was a tragedy of epic proportions. And the architect of this building said, look, this building was never designed to have manufacturing equipment in the upper floors. It just wasn't structurally sound enough for that. But garment manufacturers, in order to save costs, they created garment factories there anyway. Workers were concerned about working there. They saw cracks in the walls, cracks in the foundations. They didn't want to go in and work, but they had to. They're threatened to be fired or have their salary, their wages withheld. And so essentially, it's a difficult decision. If you're living in impoverished conditions, what are you going to do, right? So again, I mean, even though we are in the 21st century, conditions haven't seemed to have changed too much in terms of working conditions for people working in these types of industries. This is where our clothing is coming from. Here's an image that shows a protest, a worker protest of women and men who are protesting working conditions after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And here's a similar image after the Rana Plaza building collapse, another protest. So yeah, 1911 versus 2013, how much has changed? Some has changed, but not a lot. And again, the only silver lining that occurred out of this Rana Plaza collapse was some marginal incremental improvements in working conditions for workers in the garment industry, better safety conditions and whatnot, but not as much as, wow, not as much as we would like to see in the Western world, unfortunately. What did the men's shirt cost? So going back to our t-shirt, the martini glass and the squirrel holding the martini glass, this is a breakdown of what the t-shirt costs. So there's all these components, the shipping costs, the order fulfillment, the printing and so forth. You'll notice right in the middle, right here, I'll point my mouse to it. The knitting, dyeing, cutting, and sewing only costs $1. It costs $1. So all told, all the cost of the t-shirt is about $12.42. Those are the direct costs of the t-shirt that probably would retail in a regular store for about $25 to $30, I imagine. So the direct cost of the t-shirts, if you break down all the component parts, costs about $12.42, only $1 of which is the actual, like the part that we see of the construction, the cutting and sewing part, less than $1 essentially, which is pretty incredible for a shirt that probably will retail between $25 and $30 in a regular store. What else do we have here? Oh, so here is a graphic that shows the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. So many of us have heard a lot about the CPI in the news these days because inflation is kind of a runaway thing. We have a lot of concerns about prices going up. Okay, so this is a graphic that shows the Consumer Price Index. So the red line up top there, okay, so first of all, if you look at the horizontal axis, this is going across time. So we're starting in 1985, going until about 2020, the year 2020. And that top red line is the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers for all items. So the Consumer Price Index includes stuff that regular consumers consume. So food, clothing, housing, education, medical expenses, transportation, like all the stuff that typical consumers will spend money on, right? So that red line indicates that since 1985, the price level essentially has been on a kind of an upward slope. It's been increasing. It's been positive over time, right? So price level has just been going up over time. That's kind of inevitable. That's natural. That's totally normal. If you look at the lower blue line, that lower blue line is the Consumer Price Index for clothing, for apparel, the US city average. And that stayed relatively flat across time. That hasn't changed much. It went up a little bit in like 1995, it dipped down in 2005, but it stayed relatively flat for a long time. So that's indicating that the prices of clothing haven't changed that much over time. They stayed relatively flat. Here's another graphic. This shows the percent of our budget that we're spending on clothing. So again, this is across time going from 1987 to 2017 in 10-year chunks. And these bars indicate different age groups. So for example, that green bar indicates the age group of people who are 25 to 34. The light blue is 35 to 44 and so on and so forth, okay? And it shows that across time, the percent of our budget that we're spending on clothing has been falling across time amongst all age groups. And it's not because we're demanding less clothing. In fact, we're demanding more clothing than ever before. It's because the prices have been falling across time. So clothing is just getting cheaper and cheaper all the time due to a variety of reasons, which is great for a lot of people because now we can afford more outfits, maybe even more stylish outfits than we were able to afford in the past. But we see that not only are clothing prices falling, but the share of our income that is devoted toward clothing purchases has fallen over time too. Why is this the case? Well, I cannot emphasize how important fast fashion has been to the clothing industry, to the fashion industry. Super, super important. Okay, so what's fast fashion? So here's some examples of fast fashion brands. H&M, Forever 21, Zara, these are all what are known as fast fashion brands. So what they do is they'll see a fashion design come down the runway in Paris or something like that during one of the Paris shows in June or July or something like that, right? And what they'll do is they'll make a knockoff version and have it in their stores within 7 weeks. 7 weeks. It's an incredibly fast turnaround time. So it's called fast fashion because of the fact that they can see an image, a designer look, and turn around, knock it off, and get it to the shop floor in an amazingly short period of time due to a variety of reasons. Okay. And so these fast fashion brands have done so much to kind of change the landscape of the fashion industry because, as you may notice from fast fashion brands, the quality sometimes isn't always the best. The fabrics aren't always the best necessarily, but they're counting on the fact that, hey, you'll wear it a few times, you'll get bored. Here's something new that we're going to produce that you might like better. So you're going to forget about that previous thing and shop some more. Basically, the model makes it such that we're constantly shopping. They're encouraging you to constantly shop, constantly look for the next new thing. And the prices are so low that you kind of don't care if you spend a few bucks on this thing and it only lasts a few wears. They kind of don't care. Now, you yourself may not personally shop at fast fashion stores, and I'm not making any judgments about fast fashion or not. So you yourself may not shop at fast fashion stores, but these brands have had a huge impact on other traditional retailers like Banana Republic, J. Crew, Gap, and others too, many, many others. It's the impact of fast fashion just cannot be denied on the industry. So other brands have tried to keep up by increasing the number of styles that they offer, by turning over clothes really quickly, by offering sales all the time to encourage constant shopping. This is a phenomenon that is stemming from essentially this so-called fast fashion model that makes fashion turnover faster than ever before. So again, we're paying less, we're spending a smaller share of our income, but we're buying more items per person than ever before, which is kind of like an unprecedented thing. All right, where do our clothes go after we're done with them? The afterlife of a t-shirt. Okay, so this is fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating. So oftentimes I've taken clothes that I don't wear anymore. I've taken them to Goodwill and I thought, okay, maybe somebody else can get some use out of them. I'm going to drop them off at Goodwill. Great. Okay. And my thought was, well, they'll hang them up on the hangers at Goodwill. They'll sell them for some amount of money and that profits somebody. So that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing, right? Well, it turns out that my stuff that I donate or stuff that anybody donates may not necessarily end up on the Goodwill store, retail store floor. It might end up someplace else. So here's an example. This is an image of two girls at a bat mitzvah in 1993, I believe it is, right? It's this girl, Jennifer. She had a bat mitzvah. When you turn 13 in Jewish tradition, you have a bat mitzvah, or in the case of boys, it's a bar mitzvah, right? It's a celebration of a coming of age, right? And so this girl, Jennifer, she's on the left there. Her family had these t-shirts printed up kind of as a celebration of that event. And the friends she invited to that bat mitzvah each got the t-shirt. So here's an image of them back at that day, at that party, 13 years old party and wearing that t-shirt. Well, that t-shirt somehow found its way to a secondhand clothing market in Nairobi, Kenya. So here's an image of that t-shirt with a vendor holding it up right there, dancing with it too in the same t-shirt, okay? And so the Planet Money folks who are tracing that kind of travels of a t-shirt, they're curious to know, how did this bat mitzvah t-shirt end up at a secondhand vendor's booth, essentially, in Nairobi, Kenya? Well, it has to do with the global market associated with essentially secondhand clothing, used clothing, okay? And so this t-shirt that was worn a few times and then donated to Goodwill, whatnot, ended up probably packed up in a massive shipping bale, sent to another country. It ended up in Nairobi, Kenya. Vendors would get a hold of this t-shirt, try to sell it on this so-called massive secondhand market in Kenya and other places, right? And the fascinating thing is that these journalists were able to actually track down the original Jennifer. This is her now in her 30s, I guess. And she's holding up like a t-shirt that she still had, but basically this is the original Jennifer. This was her bat mitzvah t-shirt. And she was just stunned to find out that somebody who received this t-shirt at her bat mitzvah party, that t-shirt ended up in Nairobi, Kenya. So essentially the afterlife of our clothes, the stuff that we donate, sometimes may end up in the Goodwill or Salvation Army shop floor, but more often it's the case that it's going to end up in a secondhand market someplace in another part of the world. So here's an image of basically the secondhand marketplace for clothing in Nairobi, Kenya. So those big bales that you see in the bottom half of that image are bales of clothing. Here's some more images of that. And there are some entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, that will iron and resell and recut these t-shirts to charge like a kind of a markup on these shirts, right? So it's this fascinating kind of look to see what happens to our clothing after we dispose of all this massive amount of clothing that we have. Okay, so let's go to the other end of it. Let's go to luxury brands. And luxury brands are a fascinating area of study as well. So here's an example. This is an iconic bag, the Louis Vuitton bag. Okay, you could tell basically from the logo, it's instantly recognizable. It's like its whole thing, right? So Louis Vuitton is a company with a storied history. Started out as a trunk maker, okay, making trunks for people to take on sea voyages and whatnot. Now, the Louis Vuitton brand is this major fashion and luxury conglomerate, LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. And here's the CEO of Louis Vuitton, Bernard Arnault. He's this brilliant businessman who has essentially made high fashion luxury brands kind of turned the industry into what it is today in many ways. His nickname is the Wolf in Cashmere because of his very aggressive business practices. But again, he's a genius businessman, an entrepreneur that's kind of made the high-end fashion industry into what it is today. Here's a graphic that shows the Louis Vuitton group and some of the brands that are owned, not all the brands, but they have ownership in categories like wines and spirits, fashion and leather goods, perfumes, cosmetics, watches, and jewelry, and so on and so forth. So these are some brands that may be familiar to a lot of folks. So what has Louis Vuitton done? So this is Chanel. This is not a brand owned by Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, but basically every time you go to a high-end brand's website, there's some stuff that you can shop for online. Not everything, but some things that you can shop for online. So makeup, for example, or perfumes or eyewear are things that you can shop for online in all these luxury brands. Here's an example. Here's a Chanel lipstick, beautiful lipstick, branded with a Chanel logo, all this kind of stuff, right? This lipstick retails for $42. Now that's pretty expensive for a lipstick. However, it is a really relatively easy entry point into the area of a high-end brand, okay? I may not be able to afford a Chanel handbag, but hey, I can scrape together enough money for a $42 lipstick, and that is my entry point into this luxury world. Speaking of bags, the status handbag is such a thing. It's such a fascinating thing. So again, here's that Louis Vuitton. This is called the Louis Vuitton Speedy handbag, right? You know, it's instantly recognizable because of its shape, its style, the monogram, the fabric, all that kind of stuff, okay? This handbag retails for about $1,500. The Louis Vuitton Speedy retails for about $1,500. And this notion of the status handbag is a fascinating thing. And handbags are really good for the luxury goods market because of the following reasons. Retailers don't have to worry about stocking a variety of sizes for different size people. Okay, you can just stock the handbags and that is it. You don't have to worry about something fitting somebody or not fitting somebody. You just stock these bags and that is not a problem. The classic shapes, the classic styles don't ever go out of fashion. So you can stock them. You don't have to worry about getting rid of them at the end of the season. You can always sell them the following season. And also in the luxury handbag market, the markup on luxury handbags is easily 10 to 20 times the manufacturing cost, 10 to 20 times. So there's quite a profit to be made in these so-called status handbags. Here's another example going back to Chanel. This is a classic handbag that retails for about $8,800. And Chanel's interesting because it's done some pricing adjustments in different markets. So thinking about economics, it's looking at the market in Europe and then looking at the market in China, for instance. So they found that there would be a lot of people taking a trip from China and going into, say, Paris, for example, buying a bunch of Chanel handbags, whatever they're allowed to buy, and then taking them back to China. And the reason for this is because in China, if they were to try to buy the handbag in China, they'd also have to pay for the bag plus any kind of import duties, tariffs, and taxes that were levied on these imported goods. So in many ways, it was cheaper for somebody to take a trip to Paris, buy the handbags that they wanted, and come back to China with it. So in response to that, what Chanel did was raise the prices in Europe and lowered the prices in China, which understandably kind of annoyed people in Europe because they're like, why are you raising prices on us? And the reason was they gave some reason. They were talking about equilibrating the prices, all having to do with these market forces that are kind of occurring behind the scenes. Okay, so here's like kind of the mother of all status handbags. This is the Hermes Birkin. And this Hermes Birkin, the entry points for the entry level bags, if you can get them, start at about $15,000 to maybe $20,000 to $25,000. Okay, so this is like kind of an entry level bag with like normal leather, nothing exotic. And this here is the used price for an Hermes bag. So Hermes bags are like kind of like the pinnacle, the unicorn of status handbags. They're incredibly hard to get. They're long waiting lists. And unless you are super rich or super famous or both, it's really, really hard to get these things. They're quite expensive and all these things, right? But essentially, these are like the status handbags to end all status handbags. They apparently keep their value very well. So if you're thinking about an investment, they tend to retain something like 80 or 90% of the value or something like that in terms of resale. So again, this is a used price for an entry-level Hermes bag. Here's another example. This is a more exotic kind of a skin. This is orange crocodile with palladium metal and all this kind of stuff. This is, again, used price about almost $90,000. I looked at Sotheby's website, the auction house Sotheby's, and they had an article that talked about like the highest priced Hermes handbags that they'd ever sold. One sold for like $2 million in auction, but that was because that thing was covered with diamonds. And the second most expensive Hermes handbag they'd ever sold was something like $300,000. And it was some kind of like white Himalayan crocodile bag. I don't know. It was this amazingly crazy thing, right? But these are like stratospheric prices, like just incredible prices for these luxury status items that just, I guess, in a sense, they have no intrinsic value compared to like any regular, garden variety bag, but they are the coveted status items amongst the wealthy, elite, and super rich. And Hermes is able to keep this kind of elite status by limiting its production, by having these long waiting lists, by having high prices, and of course, by having excellent and beautiful craftsmanship and beautiful materials. But this kind of like scarcity that they impose on the market always ensures that the prices are high and the allure is incredibly strong for this brand. It's like, as I mentioned before, it's the unicorn of brands. The status handbag, how much is the markup of status handbags? This is fascinating too. So here's a breakdown for a typical bag: materials, labor, transits, and duties and taxes. Total cost about $80. So an honest retail price would be maybe $200, but an actual retail price tends to be closer to $1,000 is what you'll see. So designer fashion typically sells for 10 to 20 times the cost that it costs to make. And people don't bat an eye when they see these prices. So this is a company called Oliver Cabell that I'll mention in a little bit. They're trying to break down these costs to make costs more transparent so people could actually see what they're paying for, and to kind of remove that kind of, I don't know, that barrier that makes it such that people can't see what's going on behind the curtain, what's going on behind the scenes. And so they want to bring greater transparency into this luxury goods market, and so people get a better sense of what they're actually paying for. So yeah, some incredible markups that are happening in the designer handbag realm. So the future of the fashion industry. So globalization and freer trade had made it such that we can have more and cheaper fashion than ever before, faster than ever before. Technology and supply chains, the development of technology and the advancement of the efficiency of supply chains have made it such that we can get these fashion items so quickly and so cheaply. Fast fashion has had an enormous impact on the industry, but it also has an enormous environmental impact. Oh, I forgot to mention that, oh gosh, there's so much fashion that ends up in landfills. Fashion is unfortunately environmentally very unfriendly. So it has a huge environmental impact. This kind of constant production and consumption of fashion goods has a big environmental impact on the world as well, which is really kind of a bummer. Fashion in the COVID pandemic. I think a lot of us, reverted back to sweatpants and t-shirts during the COVID pandemic. I know I did. And how is fashion going to recover now that we're kind of unwinding from the COVID pandemic? Is it going to come back? Are people eager to go out and get dressed up again? Or are they still willing to stay home in their sweatpants? The jury's kind of out on this, although I know in certain industries, I think in the luxury goods market, there was some impact, especially in the year 2020. But I think it's on a rebound now. Fashion is recovering from the enormous hit that it took during the COVID pandemic. What else do we have here? Now, here are some additional brands that are fascinating to me in the sense that these are fashion entrepreneurs that are trying to make a difference. So Isabel Rana, she uses locally sourced materials. She uses ethically and environmentally friendly processes, design processes, and tries to bring good business practices to the fashion industry in terms of the fashion items. There's another fashion designer called Zero Waste Daniel, who is interested in making fashion items without wasting a lot of excess material, using recycled and upcycled materials to create new fashion designs. There's Oliver Cabell. This is the company I mentioned before, who's interested in bringing greater transparency into the luxury good market in terms of making sneakers and handbags and whatnot, so we get a better sense of what we're actually paying for. And then there are companies like bigger companies, more well-known companies like Warby Parker, who are trying to break up and shake up the monopoly that a handful of companies have gotten over the fashion eyewear industry to try to bring affordable eyewear to masses of people, make online shopping easier, and make glasses more affordable compared to what you might see in your eye doctor's office. Other companies like Patagonia, who from the start have been supporters of environmental causes, very, very strongly in support of using organic materials, finding fairly sourced materials, paying a fair wage to its workers. And a company like Stitch Fix, for example, who's using technology to try to make online shopping a little bit more personal. It's difficult to online shop for fashion items, but Stitch Fix is using a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning to try to figure out ways to make shopping online more personable and more amenable to like at-home shopping. So it seems like online shopping is the future, and Stitch Fix is one of the companies that's doing a lot to try to make online shopping a more pleasant, more personal, and more accurate kind of experience. So those are some examples of companies that I'm keeping my eye on to see like what's going to happen with them in the future. So I'd like to stop there and take any questions that you have, but thank you so much for listening so far. Steve, maybe you want to moderate questions? I can't really see what's going on here in terms of like if anyone has their hands up and whatnot. Should I stop the screen share? Oh, Steve, I think you might be muted because I can't hear you.
Yep, I was muted.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, so let's, if you have a question, just raise your hand on your screen, or if you don't know how to do that, just unmute and talk away. I know there are questions out there. So fire away. If you raise your hand, I'll call on you. There's one. Edward Evans. Go ahead.
Hey, Dr. Byun.
Hey, Edward, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Good, thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So I'm not one that would be considered fashion, inclined, but one of the things I am interested in is like, how much does it cost to recycle the materials from old or thrown away materials? Because you talked about how like you give it back to Goodwill and then it gets sent off to a different country. It would seem like it make me think that it's kind of cost prohibitive to kind of recycle the materials. So is there any feel for that or any idea of what that could look like?
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't have a cost estimate per se. However, like when I talk about Goodwill, for instance, so some percent, maybe 10% of the donated items actually end up on the Goodwill retail floor. About 30 to 40% go to textile recyclers or something like that. And then another 30 to 40% get sent abroad. So textile recycling is like another area which is fantastic, because if we can reuse these textiles for other purposes, that's really, really phenomenal, right? The issue is that sometimes textiles are kind of like mixed materials, right? So you'll notice that sometimes clothing is a blend. It's not 100% cotton, 100% wool. And that's what we're trending towards, because, pure cotton, pure wool, pure silk is pretty expensive. And so often you'll find stuff that's like a blend of cotton and polyester or wool and polyester or whatever, okay? And the thing is it's hard to disentangle the fibers once they've been, kind of spun together, right? So if you want to try to separate the fibers out, that can be quite challenging. And depending upon what you need the recycled textiles for, it's important to have, like, for example, if you're working in an oil refinery, you need to have 100% pure cotton rags. You cannot have anything that has polyester in it because it can cause static, it can cause a spark, which can cause a fire, right? And so, textile recycling is an important piece of this whole kind of like afterlife of clothes. Absolutely is, right? But it's tricky because depending upon what the fibers are and what purpose that you want to make those textiles into, recycling can be a costly enterprise or it can be an affordable enterprise, depending upon what the mix is. I couldn't help but notice in recent years, there's been an explosion in terms of things like dog beds that are really cheap, or cat beds that are really cheap, or cat toys, dog toys, stuffed cat toys, dog toys. Like, they've become incredibly cheap, right? And I realized, oh, it's because they're making them out of recycled textiles. Other recycled textiles go into things like furniture stuffing for car seats, that kind of stuff. So that there are a variety of uses in which recycled textiles can be used. It just depends upon the purpose that they're meant for at the end. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Others.
So there was just an article on one of the news shows recently about making leather out of mushrooms.
Oh, fabulous. Okay.
And I don't know whether you saw that, but they were specifically making handbags.
That's fantastic.
And this is out in California, and it was a rather interesting, they didn't say how much it costs to do all that, but that would be interesting to look into.
Oh my gosh, that is great. Yeah, I mean, I know there are some folks who won't use leather for ethical reasons, and so that is a great alternative to use mushrooms. I mean, I love how technology is used in a variety of ways to kind of get around these types of issues. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Others.
I noticed how long textiles last. So I guess the clothes that I have in my closet are probably going to last forever.
Oh,
Since,
yeah.
since
Yeah.
some of them are 50 years old.
Yeah.
Wabash. Yeah, Wabash.
Yeah.
T-shirts.
I have noticed that too. And if you got that stuff, hang on to it because you got a gold mine. I've noticed that, for example, vintage Levi's that are 100% cotton and good quality cotton are sold on the Levi's website for upwards of $100, $200, depending upon the quality, the age, and whatnot. And oh my gosh, vintage Levi's jeans are a whole other world that is fascinating to study too. That there's a whole industry there, right? But yeah, I mean, stuff that was made in the 80s, maybe even the mid 80s, maybe even late 80s. I mean, the quality of the fabrics is so much different than the kind of stuff that we can find today. You may notice that clothing that you buy today, you wear it a few times, you wash it a few times, and wow, it just doesn't look as good as when I first bought it. It's because they're made out of materials that are not meant to last, which is really sad to me, right? Because shopping isn't as fun as it used to be. Shopping isn't as pleasant as it used to be because you can't get as nice things as you used to unless you go to the really kind of like high end that are really, really expensive. It's quite pricey, if you want to get quality materials that used to be kind of a given. Like the middle of the market is kind of, I don't want to say disappeared, but it seems like we're left with the very, very low end, which is like the fast fashion stuff, or the very, very high end, which is out of reach for most regular people like you and me, and not a lot of stuff in the middle that's good quality stuff that you like, that's well made, that's well sewn, that can wear that you wear for more than like a season or something like that. It's really kind of unfortunate. So yeah, if you have any stuff that's made out of pure fibers, hang on to that stuff because that is good quality stuff that will last you.
Great. Let me, John, I see your hand up, and then we'll
Yep.
have one from Edward Evans already. Go ahead, John.
Oh, okay. It's funny, you mentioned things that were back from the day. I just was going through some old stuff. I found an old Elmore Day t-shirt that I designed in 1974
Nice.
for Dad, and I've still got it. The only problem is it has shrunk so badly that it probably would fit like a 6-year-old rather than me. But
Okay.
it's funny to see those things. But my question is, what has been the reaction of the students and the takeaway of the students from your classes, the tutorials and the other classes you've taught about fashion? Has it been a receptive audience?
It has been phenomenal. The students have been great and they've been fascinated with this industry. And one of the things we studied was fashion malls. So I didn't get into this during the talk, but the fashion malls are like a whole other thing now. And we actually took a field trip to 2 malls in Indianapolis. We went to the Keystone Mall and the Castleton Mall, and they had to study these 2 malls from a variety of perspectives. They had to look at the food court, the parking lot, the architectural design, department stores, like all these types of things. And they were each assigned a store in the mall to go and study, to look at the aesthetics, to look at the messaging and the marketing and so forth. And what I found incredibly gratifying is as we were leaving, one of the students said something like, wow, I'll never be able to look at malls the same way ever again, right? Just this class has made it such that, every time I think it's about something, there's always more to it than what I think it is, right? And that was just so incredibly gratifying for me to hear because just, again, I had some misgivings thinking about teaching a fashion class at Wabash College, like, would it be well received? What are people going to think about this? But the students, had a great experience and I learned so much too. And I learned so much from them as well. I mean, it was really, really a wonderful experience. Their final project, by the way, for the class was they had to put on a fashion show for the college community. They had to come up with a theme. They had to choose outfits. They had to choose models, the music, everything. They put on a fashion show and it was absolutely phenomenal. It was just so much fun. And we learned a lot and they had a great time. So yeah, it was really great.
Awesome. I see Dr. Pinchmet, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have to unmute here.
You're good.
Yeah, I read someplace recently that there's at least a segment of the buying population that was buying 82 clothing items per year, year after year. And I can't even imagine what you would do with so many items and how you could do anything but throw them away at a high rate.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, people are shopping more than ever before. I remember back in my day, like you shopped with your mom for back to school clothes in the fall And then maybe you might get something for Christmas. And then like basically those back to school clothes are supposed to last you for the whole year. And that was it. But nowadays people used to shop every 3 or 4 months the old days for clothing. Now they shop every maybe 3 or 4 weeks for clothing. Shopping has become kind of like an entertainment activity in and of itself. And again, as I mentioned, fast fashion has made it such that people can shop for more items for more cheaply than ever before. And the great thing about that is that it's brought fashion items to a segment of the population that may not have been able to afford as much before. But it also has a downside to it in that we're consuming more than ever before. Our closets are overstuffed and isn't necessarily high quality stuff that we're going to want to hang on to for a long time. Maybe not. Maybe not. Oh, I see there's a question in the chat box about
Yes.
costs associated with clothing. So yeah, they have gone to places with cheaper labor. I don't think that prices are going to increase anytime soon because I think we're in sort of a deflationary trap in the sense that once people see cheap prices, they keep expecting cheap prices. And if they were to see prices that were more in line with what we should be paying for clothing, they would hesitate to pay those prices. They'd be like, oh, I can't afford that. What are you talking about? Charging more than $20 for a t-shirt. I myself have done that too. I'm a big shopper at TJ Maxx and Marshalls. I love it, right? So anything more than $20 seems just too expensive, right? So, yeah, I think we're kind of stuck in this mindset where stuff has to be cheap. It's supposed to be cheap. I think the pendulum's swinging back gradually the other direction though, because I think people are realizing, wow, I can buy a lot of stuff, but it's not necessarily stuff that I want to hang on to, that I love that much. It's disposable, throwaway stuff that's not really giving me any sense of satisfaction or sense of like, wow, this is who I am as a person. This is just a cheap throwaway item. That is not me. I want to look for something more. So I'm thinking it's starting to swing back the other direction, but it's going to be like this for a long time.
Interesting. We have time
With the price
for,
of petroleum, with the price of petroleum going up, is it possible that natural fibers are going to come back?
I
It
hope
becomes cheaper?
so. Yeah, I really hope so. That is a great question because I think it's going to be a while before that price of petroleum is going to translate into higher costs for clothing. But I mean, there are some legacy brands, wools in particular, like so I've studied the woolens industry in the UK a little bit. So there are some companies that are making an effort to preserve legacy brands and breeds of wools to make sure that that industry survives. And so there are pockets there where people are trying really hard to revive textiles and the textile industry in those segments. So there are some that are happening.
right. We have time for one more question. Anybody have one? There's another one in chat.
Edward, Edward.
Yeah.
Edward asked me how many of those broken backs are rocking. Exactly 0. Now I can't help. I gotta confess something to you all. After I studied how the luxury industry is, sort of like the wool fell from my eyes, right? Like I just saw how. I mean, look, the luxury market is phenomenal. It's beautiful. It's artistic. It's all these things that I fully acknowledge. All these things, absolutely glorious, glamorous, all these things, right? And so for those who can afford these things, great, fantastic. I'm not judging or anything like that, right? But I realized how much these brands have gone and worked so hard to make these things so aspirational, to create so much envy and desire in our hearts to obtain these items, such that people will rob, they'll cheat, they'll steal, they make counterfeit items, anything that they can do to put those logos on their back. And I thought, wow, what a manipulation that is. All of it is so much consumer manipulation that's happening to kind of part us with our money, to make us not into independent, free-thinking people who make their own decisions based upon rational choices, what works in our lives, but to sell us an idea of what our identity should be. We have to have that Louis Vuitton bag on our arm to be something or mean something. And that is just all nonsense. We are all independent thinkers with our own style and our own fashion and our own identities that we can express without forking over a ton of money to some faceless corporation who's just going to take it from us. So that's my closing message. So thank you. Yes. Make fashion your own.
Fantastic.
Thank you for asking me, Edward.
Hey, I want to be respectful of Dr. Byun's time and all of your time. And how about a virtual round of applause for Dr. Byun? That was fascinating stuff, I got to tell you. And look, it's a beautiful day here, those of you in central Indiana. And she took this hour to be with you. She could have been outside with her family. So we certainly appreciate your time, Dr. Byun. Hey, thanks for joining us wherever Wabash event. If you've done this before, you realize you will be getting a survey from me asking you some questions about this event. And I hope you found it fascinating. I certainly did, and hope to see you all on wherever Wabash events. Wabash.edu/www is where you can find those events. So thank you, everybody. Be safe. Dr. Byun, certainly appreciate it.
You're
Take care.
welcome. And if anyone has any questions or wants any articles for me to send or whatever, please feel free to reach out. Okay, I'd be happy to talk fashion with anybody.
Fantastic. Thank you.